It's been over 20 years since Major League Baseball's Expos left Montreal, and judging by the men and women crying on camera in Netflix's latest sports doc, the pain is still there. Now, the film does its best to live up to its title and give Expos fans the villain they've always wanted. From the start, that comes in the form of David Samson, the club's former de facto president, now 20 years wiser, takes center stage as one of the documentary's guides through the brutal demise of the Expos. It's our pleasure to welcome back onto the show David Samson, the former executive vice president of the Montreal Expos, now the host of the podcast Nothing Personal. David, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back and going through the process of this documentary and how it started when they first reached out. I did not know the title of the documentary when they reached out. They just wanted to know if I would be interviewed for a documentary about the Expos. And the answer was, yeah, I wanted to make sure that I certainly had my point of view out there. I didn't know who else would be interviewed. And then they called back and said, by the way, it's called Who Killed the Montreal Expos? I said, wait a minute. Did you have me facing to the right and facing to the left? I don't remember that as part of the interview. But I found that the movie, the director, the producers, the talent people, so professional, so thorough in their research, their ability to tell a story, phenomenal. And do I agree with everything everyone said? Of course not. But do I appreciate that everyone had an opportunity to say it? Yes, I do.
Do you think they were fair to you?
I do. It's funny. What does that mean? I was thinking about that because my son asked me the same question, and he was born in 2003. So to him, the Montreal Expos, it might as well have been around World War II. And he asked me whether or not it was fair. And I said to him, yes, because fair is in the eye of the beholder. Everyone can look at a situation that's the exact same situation and have a totally different view of it. And that can be from the same angle. In this story, people are looking at it from totally different angles. So, of course, they're going to see it differently. And I think that I think they did a good job of presenting all of the different sides. And again, it's up to the people to decide, who killed the Montreal Expos.
You serve a couple of purposes in the film. Obviously, one of the suspects, right? On Who Killed the Montreal Expos, you are a suspect. But you also serve a bit as a guide, right? The way the director used you in various bits and pieces. I wonder, as you're watching the film and you see your role, what's going through your mind?
Well, every documentary, and I love movies and I love documentaries, you need somebody to carry the story forward. You need someone to be almost like the narrator. Because remember, the story of the Expos, it's a really emotional story for the people involved, but the movie's made for people who have no idea of any of this. So there has to be a beginning, a middle, and end. There has to be context. There has to be emotion. There has to be conflict. There has to be the reasons why it's going to be popular and people are going to want to watch it. And so I think that during the course of my interview, I realized what role I could potentially play. Of course, I had no idea what the edit was. I didn't know the title, as I told you. But I knew as I was talking that I wanted to make sure that I was giving complete answers with context, pretending that I was talking to people who literally would have no idea what I'm talking about.
In this documentary, there's one point where you mention, I forget exactly how you put it, but you say like, the percentage of blame that does go on you, right? So I guess I got to ask you, what's the percentage? In the question of who killed the Montreal Expos, what percent do you put on yourself?
So what I said is that I think the limited partners, the Canadians, those big business people, those wealthy individuals who were running companies, and they had an opportunity to have the entire story happen differently. And I reminded people that Jeffrey Loria, as the owner, and me as the executive vice president, but I was really the president, we were not the first choice of Major League Baseball. They wanted Stephen Bronfman. They wanted anyone local. Anybody. It could have been Jacques Menard, for crying out loud. May he rest in peace. It could have been Pierre Michaud, Jean Coutu, all of them, Jocelyn Proto, anybody. They wanted a Canadian because it was important to Claude Brochu. It was important to Charles Bronfman. And remember, Charles Bronfman was very close to Bud Selig, who was the commissioner at the time. And so Jeffrey was like, hey, no one's doing the deal. And baseball realized that's true. No one's doing the deal. And it's not as though they weren't well represented. The top business minds and the top legal minds represented Claude Brochu and the limited partners. And we negotiated with all of them. And any document they signed, they read or should have read. They negotiated very hard. And I mean hard. And so all of the rhetoric that they didn't know what they were signing, to me, I dismiss that because that's not on me. So if I'm going to give myself a percentage, I'm going to say the limited partners are at least 66% of the reason the Expos died. I will say the strike in '94 had an impact. Charles Bronfman had an impact. I had an impact.
The Big O, the Olympic Stadium, I think is the what that gets some blame.
It's interesting. What percentage would I put on the Big O? That's like blaming, the old. The fact is, you can't blame a stadium. You can blame the government for not helping to finance a new stadium. You can blame Charles Bronfman and Claude Brochu for not going faster to get a new stadium. But to actually blame, I love the Big O. God, do I ever. I'm going to give myself 6.9%. I think that's probably the right number. And it means that either way, it was going to happen. But I certainly was there. And I mentioned this in an interview somewhere in the last week. One thing I got from watching this documentary, because I did watch it start to finish, I really underestimated the emotional toll that this process took on some of the employees and on some fans and on people. Because when you're doing business, I got to tell you, I didn't used to think about that ever. And I moved the Expos to Florida, and sold the Expos, bought the Marlins, and brought all sorts of Expos employees with us to Florida, but left a bunch in Montreal who ended up working for baseball. And I just didn't give that enough thought. I don't think it would have changed anything. As a matter of fact, I'm honestly telling you it would not have. But having more empathy is just something I never had. And I've learned with age to try to be better about that. And
and that's why I referenced off the top, like you're 20 years wiser, because I felt it on the current David Samson versus the archival footage. I definitely felt that. Now, David, there's the question of who shows up in the film, right? And there's you, and there's all types of great legends, Pedro Martinez and Larry Walker and Felipe Alou and the journalists and on and on and on. There's also a question of who doesn't show up. Like you mentioned, the politicians. Premier of Quebec, Lucien Bouchard at the time, refused an interview. Those minority partners that you mentioned, except for Mark Rudenberg, everyone else refused an interview. Do you think it's what's more telling is who refused to tell their story?
I never like speaking in the negative like that, but it certainly is important to look at. I don't think it changes the narrative. I think that the limited partners, the reason why they filed a lawsuit against us way back in the day is they needed to save face. They needed Montrealers to believe that they had nothing to do with the Expos leaving. I got the feeling early on after I moved to Montreal that, wow, these guys are really not interested. We wanted them to buy season tickets. They would not even buy season tickets. And limited partners, that's one of the things they do is buy season tickets to the team that they own. You don't get them for free. And I just realized that they just wanted no culpability. And I think it's clear all these years later that they're all extremely culpable. And I'm sorry for that. I think it would have been better for them to come out and be honest and say, listen, we don't feel like throwing good money after bad. We don't agree that it can work right now. We don't have a deal with the government for help to get a ballpark, and we can't get it privately financed. We can't find a local Canadian to be the general partner and the majority owner of the team. Why not be honest with people? And that's part of what I try to do now on my show, Nothing Personal, is try to cut through all the crap and not treat people like they're stupid.
You said at one point in the doc, baseball in Montreal does not work. Was that a definitive forever statement?
Well,
or can you see with the right billionaire it working in this city?
So I've been clear from the start on Montreal. Let me remind you, it's the #1 favorite road city to this day for big leaguers who were around back then, for former big leaguers. When I talk to current players, they're like, man, I wish there were a team in Montreal. So here's the thing. We can talk about currency equalization, which was a real issue when I first got to Montreal. Baseball used to pay money to the Blue Jays and the Expos from the other teams, not part of revenue sharing. It was a currency equalization payment, and that went away. The other owners didn't want to do that. But that's a real issue when you're the only teams paying American expenses and getting Canadian revenue. That's real. What Montreal needs is a real ballpark, and it needs to be publicly financed. And I don't mean like the ridiculousness of Stu Sternberg with sharing a team and building an open air where they'd only play during the summer but then disappear for the playoffs in April. Who's going to invest in that? That whole plan was concocted from the beginning. But an actual ballpark plan that is presented to Major League Baseball, that's number one. Number two, a way to guarantee revenue, because one of the issues in that documentary, there were a lot of pictures of the Big O full of fans. Well, I can tell you, if you go back and look at Claude Brochu, Charles Bronfman, look at me, and you look at attendance, this wasn't me. This was night one attendance was 30,000. Night two attendance was 5,000. That was long before I got there and long after I left. Yeah. And that you can't have if you're going to have a team.
That leads me to the Big O thing, because one thing that's forgotten is Montrealers our summer is so short. And once the Olympic Stadium roof became permanent, remember, it was supposed to retract, didn't work very well. Once you told Montrealers, hey, enjoy your June, July, and August enclosed in the Big O, not going to work. And I think that like when I look at those attendance statistics, once this roof gets affixed permanently, there is a drop for the rest of the franchise.
I would tell you that I thought attendance in Miami would improve when we opened the new ballpark. There are a bunch of cities that have not seen the increased attendance that they thought they would with the new ballpark. You have to win, which I didn't do enough of in Florida, even though we won a World Series. And you have to have it in the right location. And people will say, well, you had a deal. You had the land downtown. Yeah, that was amazing. It was perfect. I traveled around the country visiting ballparks and figuring out ways to make that ballpark so good. But we just didn't have a finance plan. And there is no way that any individual would pay for a stadium on his or her own. It just doesn't work that way. We couldn't even get infrastructure help from the government. We could not get anything. So I don't mean to go on and on, but the Yankees and Mets, people will say, oh, those were privately built ballparks. That's not true. The state, the county, the city put in hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure as part of those deals, tax savings, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways to do a deal, and Montreal and Quebec wouldn't do any of it.
Before I let you go, let's talk a bit of Jays here. Maybe if the Jays deserve a percentage on killing the Expos, whether it's like not sharing the TV rights of the whole country, right? Splitting up the country, or they voted to contract the Expos. Or, I mean, that's just historical record there.
Yes, they did.
Any blame on the Jays, David, before we root for them in a few seconds?
No, but I must say that I did enjoy Ed Rogers standing up after winning the pennant to say, this is for all of Canada, and we're doing this for you. We are Canada's team. What he was saying, read between the lines, don't you think you're going to have expansion in Western Canada or Eastern Canada, because we are Canada's team, and they're owned by a company that is obviously across Canada, and they want no part of another baseball team in Canada. I found it interesting that he went to that. I don't know if you saw that after they won the pennant.
I did.
That was a very telling moment. Am I rooting for the Blue Jays? You bet your bippy I am.
So Vladimir Guerrero Jr. versus Shohei Ohtani. What's your prediction for the series?
My prediction, I picked the Dodgers to win the World Series before the season started. So I have to stay with that. And I went with it in 7 games. But deep down, here's the thing. Look at game 1 and game 2. If Snell and Yamamoto go 17 innings again, the Blue Jays are finished. Just finished. You've got to have them go 11 or fewer innings between those two pitchers in the first 2 games, and then I think the Blue Jays can win the series.